is a 2010 Jeep Grand Cherokee SRT8, the original Grand Cherokee SRT8. It was also one of the original fast SUVs and one of my all-time favorite fast SUVs because it wasn't luxurious or nice or well-appointed or well-equipped. It was fast. And today, I'm going to review this Jeep. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website with cool cars from the modern era. We've had some great sales recently on Cars and Bids, including this 2001 BMW 740i with an E39 M5 drivetrain and transmission swap, which sold for over $28,000. This Mercedes-Benz R63 AMG, the 500 horsepower minivan, sold for $38,500, and this off-roader Porsche Cayenne Turbo, an amazing car that I wanted, sold for $28,000. If you're looking to sell your cool car from the modern era, the 80s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. And if you're looking to buy a cool car from that era, check out Cars and Bids Daily Auctions amazing selection at carsandbids.com. I've borrowed this Grand Cherokee from a viewer in the Los Angeles area, and I'm going to start with a little overview. Now, this was not the first high-performance SUV. By the time the Grand Cherokee SRT8 came out in 2006, that trail had already been blazed by the GMC Typhoon, the Porsche Cayenne Turbo, the BMW 4.6 IS. But while those models relied on turbocharging or slight power upgrades to get to their high-performance SUV status, Jeep did it the old-fashioned way, by hot rodding. Specifically, Chrysler was making high-performance SRT versions of its Dodge Charger, Dodge Magnum, and Chrysler 300s with a big ol' 6.1-liter muscle car style V8. And someone said, hey, I got an idea. Why don't we put that in the Grand Cherokee, our mid-size family SUV, primarily driven by suburban dads who wear a baseball cap to cover up the fact that they're balding. Now, at every other car company, this would have just gotten a laugh and they would have moved on. At Chrysler, they built it. So what you have here is a Jeep Grand Cherokee with a 6.1-liter V8. It made 420 horsepower and 420 pound-feet of torque. When this came out, it had 80 horsepower more than the top-level BMW X5, and it was only 30 horsepower behind the Porsche Cayenne Turbo. It was also faster than the Cayenne Turbo and faster than the Mercedes ML63 AMG. This was a titan of the high-performance SUV world. And it was cheap. The Grand Cherokee SRT8 started just under $40,000 when it came out in 2006, which is the equivalent of around $50,000 today, far less than the current base price of a Grand Cherokee SRT, which is just under $70,000. Back in 06, this was a cheap muscle car SUV. And today, I'm going to take you on a tour of it. First, I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Grand Cherokee SRT8 by discussing one of its most notable quirks, and that would be its cheapness. You see, most of the other high-performance SUVs being built when this came out were luxury SUVs, but not this car. In fact, this era of the Grand Cherokee, the WK model as people call it, was really criticized sharply for its cheapness all around, and that certainly extended to the SRT8 version, even though it was the top of the model line. I'll give you a few examples. One is the key. You can see this key. I always called it the Chrysler grenade key because it looks like a hand hand grenade, and you can see there are 5 buttons on it: the alarm, lock, unlock, open the tailgate, and start the car. There are also 2 blanks. And you might be thinking, well, that's a lot of functions. What could those blanks possibly be for? The answer is nothing. You could only get those blanks filled if you got a minivan from this era, and then those buttons could be used to open the power sliding doors. And that meant no matter how much you spent on a Chrysler pickup truck or SUV or sedan, you were always gonna have blanks on your key. Could they have made a different key for the minivans? Of course. Did they want to spend the money? Of course not. And next we move on to some other cheapness quirks of this Grand Cherokee, starting in the driver's footwell, where you have this hump that intrudes quite a bit. Every other car is able to be made without a large hump that sticks into the driver's footwell, but Chrysler didn't bother taking it out, so that's what you have. And you also have a really tiny, narrow floor mat as a result, because the hump takes up so much space. Pure early 2000s Chrysler. And it goes far beyond that. Look around the gear lever and you can see there's this cool carbon fiber looking trim, since this is the SRT8 model. You also have this carbon trim around the center control stack, the climate controls, the infotainment screen, everywhere. But you don't have it in the cup holder area right next to the gear selector. So you have 2 different materials there. They were too cheap to make that carbon look as well. And you also don't have it between the center control stack and the gear selector. There's another black plastic piece that doesn't match the parts right next to it. Again, classic Chrysler cheaping out. And by the way, you have the same carbon fiber trim situation over on the door panel. You can see the area around the window switches is trimmed in this carbon look to make it feel sporty, but nothing else on the door panel is. It's all just the same cheap plastic from everywhere else. So as long as you only look at the window switch area, you'll be reminded you're in the sporty Jeep. And another obvious example of Chrysler cost cutting in here. In the center control stack, you can see there are quite a few buttons above and below the climate controls, but most of them are blank. In fact, there are 8 blank buttons and only 6 functional buttons in this button area. And of course, this was the top-end Grand Cherokee, so you probably couldn't fill up all of these buttons with stuff no matter what you did. You were always going to get blanks. And Chrysler was like, whatever. And another example of the cheapness comes on the front fender, where you have an antenna. And not one of those antennas that can pop up when you turn on the radio, which cars had in the 90s, and not an antenna that's hidden in the glass or somewhere else, which a lot of cars had in the 2000s. No, this is a 2010 model with a fixed antenna. Way after that was acceptable to put in a car, Jeep was still doing it. What a surprise. But really the biggest problem in this interior is the general quality of everything. Nothing in here is nice, pretty much at all. Everything is cheap plastic everywhere. In a lot of cases, the plastic doesn't line up with the material right next to it. You have different color and surface plastics directly next to each other, which only serves to underscore the fact that it wasn't really thoughtfully put together. And why are the center climate vents trimmed in silver, which is the only silver trim on the dashboard? The other climate vents are not trimmed in silver, just the center ones. Makes no sense, and it doesn't really look good. Another good example of the poor general quality is the steering wheel. This is not a performance car steering wheel. Something that's faster than a Cayenne Turbo shouldn't have this wheel. It's not thickly bolstered. The center looks cheap and unsporty, and nothing about this says high performance or expensive in any way. Speaking of the steering wheel, this car also doesn't have a very high performance or expensive sounding horn. Take a listen. With that said, you do have some niceties in this interior. For example, you have power adjustable pedals. Press this little switch over to the left of the steering wheel and you can see the pedals will automatically move forward or backward to accommodate taller or shorter drivers without having to move everything else. That is a nice little touch. And you also had seat memory. Look on the door panel. You can see this little switch allows you to program up to 2 settings of seat memory, which is of course nice and luxurious. And speaking of the seat, seats, this car had cool ones. You have these highly bolstered sports seats, which look cool, very fitting for a performance vehicle like this. Alcantara in the center, which looks nice, and of course it says SRT on the seat back. So these seats were a high point in this otherwise lackluster interior. Another high point in this interior is the fact that this Jeep has a Ferrari infotainment system. Yes, that's right, this center screen was, well, actually a Chrysler infotainment system, but then Fiat and Chrysler merged and they started sticking this screen in Ferraris. And so you get into a Ferrari FF, a California, basically any Ferrari from this era, and it has this exact same infotainment screen. It is not especially high quality, and it looked way worse in the Ferraris than it looks in the Jeeps, but at least you drive one of these, you can tell people about your Ferrari technology. It also has a little secret. Press this open-close button in the upper left and, well, just look, the screen folds down so you can put in a CD. Now that is high quality and cool. By the way, speaking of this screen, you can see a shift into reverse and it has a disastrous backup camera. Terrible resolution, but it is worth noting it's pretty good that it had any backup camera at all in 2010. That's a nice feature, even if it's not the best quality. And speaking of screens in this car, the gauge cluster is obviously not a screen. That technology didn't come till later, but it has little screens in it, and there's some cool performance info in here. You scroll through these little pages, you can see it shows your 1/8 mile time, your 1/4 mile time, your braking time, your G-forces. This is sort of an early example of the Chrysler performance pages that modern ones have in full color in their center infotainment screen. And it's pretty cool to see all those performance metrics in the gauge cluster. They really knew what people were going to be doing with these vehicles. And speaking of that little screen in the gauge cluster, I must admit, I like the fact that when you turn this on, it says SRT8 in about 20 black and white pixels, but still it's there, looks cool, and reminds you of the special vehicle that you're driving. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the SRT8 Jeep, which isn't really all that big. The latest Grand Cherokee has grown compared to this one, which is a good thing because there's not that much room back here for a mid-size SUV. I'm kind of surprised at how tight it is. Now, there are a few interesting quirks and features back here, starting with the fact that the rear seats are kind of cool. Not quite the sports seats you have in the front, but you do have those Alcantara seat centers that's carried on back here, and it looks neat. You also have some seat bolstering. You can especially see it in the center. So your seats in the back will keep you a little bit in place when you're on the racetrack. Again, not quite like in the front, but it's nice to see it's not just a flat, ugly bench seat back here. And next up, a few notable features back here. For one, you have heated rear seats. Press these buttons to turn them on. That was a really uncommon feature back when this car was new, but the SRT8 had it, even though it also had a fixed exterior antenna. You also have a power outlet back here, a household style outlet. Just take off this cover and there it is, so you can plug in your toaster while you drive. One other nice feature back here, you see this little tab on the bottom of the center seat. Well, that's your cup holders. You pull it forward and then your cup holders come out and you can stick your drinks back here while you're being driven along in the SRT8. And next up, we move on to the exterior of the SRT8. And I want to talk about all the differences compared to the regular Grand Cherokee, starting with the wheels. I have always loved these wheels. This car came out when I was 16 years old, and very few vehicles had 20-inch wheels at the time like this does. And they just looked so cool and so special, and you always knew you were looking at an SRT when you saw these giant chrome wheels. I'm always surprised when people swap out the wheels in these Grand Cherokees because these were so distinctive for this car, and I love their look. But obviously the wheels weren't the only distinguishing feature on the outside compared to the standard Grand Cherokee, although SRT badges were not all over this car. In fact, there's only one on the tailgate and back. You can see it says SRT8. That was it really on the outside, except there are little subtle SRT badges on these wheels, all 4 of them. So you had some SRT badging if you looked really closely at the wheels, but otherwise it was just that one badge on the tailgate. Not that you really needed a lot of badges to tell this apart from the standard Grand Cherokee, because on the outside there were a lot of other ways it was clear. For one thing, up front, you just had a more aggressive front end. It came down lower, it looked bolder, more aggressive, more sporty, and if you saw one of these from the front, it was very clear what you were looking at. You also got Brembo brakes with these for better stopping power, and that meant red brake calipers, the universal sign of a performance car, another way you could tell apart the SRT8. And this had Bilstein sport suspension, which meant better handling, but it also meant that the ride height came down just a little bit compared to the standard model, so you didn't have as much off-road ground clearance like you'd expect from a Jeep, but you did have a lower center of gravity like you would expect from a performance car. But by far the coolest way you could tell apart the Grand Cherokee SRT8 from the other models was the exhaust. For one thing, it was huge. It was also in the middle, which meant that all this extra power you got in the SRT model, you couldn't tow, because you couldn't mount a tow hitch here, because this is where the exhaust was. It was kind of an odd decision, but this wasn't really intended to be a tow vehicle anyway. It's a performance car, and so the exhaust does the thing that performance car exhaust should do. It sounds fantastic. Take a listen. And next up, we move on to the tailgate of the SRT8. A couple of interesting quirks here. For one thing, the back window can open separately of the tailgate itself. You can pop open just the window. I love this feature because if you just want to load in something small, you don't necessarily want to open the whole tailgate and then have to close it. Being able to open up just the rear window is so useful, and I love the few cars that still do this. Most automakers don't do it because it adds complexity. The rear wiper has to find a new home. You can see in this case it's mounted on the tailgate itself, and obviously then you have to have two separate opening things back here. It's just more challenging, but I think it's a great idea. Now, interestingly, in this Jeep, the key fob, you can see, has a button to open up the tailgate, but when you press it, it only opens up the rear window. And in fact, there's no button on the key fob that will open up the full tailgate. To do that, you have to pull on this little lever above the license plate. That's the only way you can get the tailgate open. The key fob won't do it. But anyway, you pull on that little lever, you open up the tailgate, and you can see the cargo area. Or in this vehicle's case, a giant piece of stereo equipment that takes up most of the cargo area. Not exactly the most practical. This is one of the few modifications to this SRT8. The others are a lightly upgraded set of mufflers and a K&N air filter under the hood, but that's it. And I say that's it because it's notable. Only 15,000 of these first-gen SRT8 Grand Cherokees were made, and the vast majority have been heavily modified in crazy ways, but this one remains pretty unmodified, which is tremendously difficult to find. By the way, one other interesting quirk I like back here, you can see on the floor of the cargo area there's a little line that says load to this line. You can only put your stuff this far if you want the tailgate to close. That is a nice, helpful little guide that I wish more cars had, frankly. And finally, we move under the hood to the best part of the Grand Cherokee SRT8, because the truth about this vehicle was, didn't really matter all that much that it was cheap inside, because it had the big wheels and it had the big engine. In this case, it was a 6.1 liter V8 that was borrowed from the Dodge Charger SRT8 and the Chrysler 300C SRT8 and the Magnum. Now, this has become a lot more commonplace, these performance SUVs with big engines, and in fact, the latest Grand Cherokee now uses the 700 horsepower V8 from the Hellcat. But back when this came out, it was totally unheard of. It was a complete factory hot rod. It was something that you would discuss with your buddies while you were chatting about cars. What if they put a big V8 in a Grand Cherokee? And then they actually did it. 420 horsepower, 420 pound-feet. Again, those numbers don't sound all that great by modern standards, but this was faster than the Cayenne Turbo at the time. It was the fastest performance SUV on sale when it came out. It was a really, really impressive vehicle. And so those are the quirks and features of the 2010 Jeep Grand Cherokee SRT8. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the SRT8 Jeep, and I just have to do it. Yes! Oh yeah! Oh yeah, that just sounds and feels so good. But then you go over bumps and it doesn't quite feel as good because this car was not built all that well. So this car is an interesting one for me because there's huge pros and huge cons. The drawback is obvious. The quality is terrible. Everybody knows the WK Grand Cherokee was a low point in Grand Cherokee production. The interior, my friend Perry says, it was almost like they were trying to be offensive. And really, the cheapest, crappiest plastic you could find everywhere with no quality materials in sight. And really, that was a shame. But it was almost part of this car's charm somehow. It was like all you needed was an engine and some wheels and some Brembos to forget about all of your problems in here. And I was a kid, this came out, I remember reading all these road tests saying it's fast, it's fun, but it's so bad inside. And it was like, yeah, but it's a Chrysler. You know, I drove a Neon SRT4 and I referred to that as cheap speed. It was a crappy car, but it was fast. That was this, except in mid-size SUV form. This is not a expensive car. This does not feel like a well-built car, but you drive it and it's like, I don't really care about any of that stuff. I just want to have some fun in this car. And it was perfect for that. It was amazing at that. And really the performance is fantastic. 0 to 60 in 4.6 by the standards of its time was unreal. The Cayenne Porsche rated at like 5 seconds. Magazines were getting it at like 4.8. This thing was knocking down 4.6, 0 to 60 all day long. These days, like I said, this car adjusted for inflation started at 50 grand. The new one starts at 70. So even adjusted for inflation, this is 20 grand cheaper. And you can feel it inside. But the new car, as great as it is, and it is a fantastic vehicle, this one, there was just a charm about the fact that it was crap, but it was, yes, yes! Oh, I love it. I love it. I was a kid when these were coming out. I was 16, the Charger SRT8, the 300C SRT8. And it was cars like this that were really getting us out of a kind of a doldrum period in the car world. The early 2000s, mid 2000s, I've said in many videos, I think are going to go down as a fantastic time to be a car enthusiast, much like the 60s. And it was vehicles like this that made that happen. Chrysler coming back with rear-wheel drive with big V8s. It was just a totally different company. And the legacy of vehicles like this lives on today in the new SRT Grand Cherokee, all the SRT cars, the Hellcat, Challenger, everything. Now, as for the actual driving experience of this car, I'm surprised. This one is in really nice shape. It has under 50,000 miles, unmodified. It's a really nice car. It accelerates well. The transmission, not as dull as I was expecting. I thought the transmission would be a big culprit in making the car feel slow, but it really doesn't. It's actually fairly reasonable, I would say. In terms of handling, ultimately, it feels like a 2006 Jeep. It's not that bad, actually. It's lowered Bilsteins, bigger wheels, better tires, but it still doesn't have kind of the high-performance vehicle feeling that the new one has or that a sports car would have. Overall, the truth is, I just really love this thing. It's one of my favorites. I've actually never driven one, a first-gen SRT8 Jeep, but I've always thought it looked amazing. It was rare. They only made, like I said, less than 15,000 of these, and it was a really special car, especially at that time period when stuff like this just didn't exist. Crappy inside, but who really cared? Cheap speed, and there was serious speed. And so that's the 2010 Jeep Grand Cherokee SRT8. This wasn't supposed to be a luxury car. It wasn't meant to compete with the Porsche Cayenne Turbo or the Mercedes ML63 AMG, except in one way. It was fast. By modern standards, the interior is not very nice, the technology is dated, and the design is getting tired, but it's still really freaking fast. And now it's time to give the Grand Cherokee SRT8 a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, these look cool with big wheels and the body kit, and it gets a 6 out of 10, which is pretty good for a mid-size SUV. Acceleration 0 to 60 is 4.7 seconds, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Handling is sharper than you'd think for a Grand Cherokee, though ultimately it is still a Grand Cherokee, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is huge. This is a hoot to drive with big power and great sound, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Cool factor is also high. These are becoming increasingly desirable and head-turning, as not that many are left, especially in nice shape, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 30 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It's okay, it has the basics but not much more, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Comfort is fine, though the ride is a bit rough, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is abysmal. These are relatively reliable, but the materials inside are just awful, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Practicality is normal for an SUV like this, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Finally, value, and it's fantastic. Big power, special, rare car, and kind of a trailblazer in the world of the performance SUV. These deserve to be worth way more than the like 15 to 20 grand they go for, and I think someday they might increase. It gets an 8 out of 10 for a total daily score of 29 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 59 out of 100, which places it here, although it's hard to find relevant cars to compare against the Grand Cherokee SRT8. There are a lot of newer performance SUVs that make sense for a comparison, but back in the mid-2000s, the SRT8 was one of the few. It helped to start a segment, and it did so with a bang, and with some big chrome wheels. I really love these Jeeps, and I kind of want one for myself.